This conference will now be recorded.
Are we good? Are we all here?
We hear you perfect, but we still have to wait 2 more minutes.
Hello,
People
George.
are arriving.
Madame Bachelet, hello.
Hi, Mthunzi.
I'm
Hi,
trying
how
to
are you?
I'm
very, very good. Can't complain. Is Mr. Vermijs with us or not yet? David? Don't see David.
Oh, he is here. They are all here, Mthunzi.
Is David there?
Yeah, they're all here.
Okay, so we can start in 2 minutes. Just wanted to make sure that everybody is connected. I'm just from another webinar where I had to address the ministers of labor of the African Union, and things were a bit difficult there. There was about not as many people as we've got here, about 123, but some of the colleagues, the connections were not good at all, which provided big problems, especially with translation within French and English and so on. So I hope we'll have good connections on our side. And I think we might as well start. I think everybody that needs to be here is here. And my president is here, Mr. Keresepi. Hello, sir.
Hello to all of you.
Thank you. So if that's okay, I'm starting. Rather start early than late, if that's all right with everybody, so we can release all these busy people to go back to what they do. Oh, Professor Lupik. So also see a professor, good friend of mine from the UK. Welcome. Colleagues, I think that the way to start is first again to say hello to the dear Commissioner, High Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. I'll make just a very short opening statement as we then move to our agenda. We welcome all the people who are connected. We have a very overwhelming response to the digital conference. We had something in the order of about, I think, 600 people. I can't remember whether I'm confusing my webinars because I'm going to another one afterwards. One was 360, one was 600, but we were struggling to increase the number because we couldn't find the salespeople at the company that we use so that we could open the lines. But I think 360, I think, is the number we had. So we all, I think, have been listening to everybody sharing that we are in very challenging times. The scale of the impact of the COVID pandemic is, as well as its reach across sectors and countries globally, is completely unprecedented. It's been referred by some people as the train wreck, compared to the global financial crisis being referred to as a car crash. That to show you the huge disparity between the perception and how people see that this one will leave a disastrous trail. There are many human rights facets to the pandemic. Health is obviously one, but the employment and economic impact of the crisis is disastrous, threatening the livelihoods of many millions of people which do not have access to proper social protection, undermining their right to employment, undermining their right to life, and undermining their right to food. We are told, for example, by the United Nations Food Program Executive Director that we are facing hunger levels of historic biblical proportions, as he put it, with almost double acute hunger levels by the end of 2020 at more than 250 million people. The IOE, the International Organization of Employers, which is the organization I represent and to which is very familiar to all of you, together with ITUC, the umbrella body for trade unions, a few weeks ago made a call to arms for a global fund with institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and others collaborating and offering favorable terms to countries, especially developing ones, and asking the UN to be the umbrella body that helps in uniting all these people. The IOE and ITUC and industrial and international brands and retailers, as well as the ILO, also launched a joint call for action to address the impacts in the garment supply chains last week. Some of you would have followed that there was absolute trouble in the countries that have the garment, that rely a lot on the garment stroke clothing industry, with a lot of cancellations of big orders and things like that was happening because of the troubles that we are all faced with. So we needed to come up with a solution. It's really an effort. All these are efforts to mobilize collective action to support each other and make sure that we are able to survive and hopefully thrive in the post-pandemic era. The IOE has also approached the extraordinary G20 labor ministers meeting last week, represented by our president, Errol Keresepi, who is on this call, to support business continuity through access to finance, as well as the development of social protection, alongside the Director General of the ILO. And just a few hours ago, as I mentioned, I was at the AU Ministers of Labour doing exactly the same. Individual companies have developed measures and protocols to protect the health of their workers, particularly now in times where in many countries restrictions are losing up and firms are starting to go back to work. The pandemic is showing different stages of development in various parts of the world. In some it has ended, in some it's ending, in some it's starting, in some it's rebounding. It is a monumental human rights fiasco. The human rights impact of the pandemic goes even much further. I just want to mention here issues such as data protection and risks linked to surveillance technology, as well as the fear of increased discrimination and xenophobia. Under the UN guiding principles, companies have the responsibilities to protect human rights. Moreover, companies face, particularly in a crisis such as the COVID pandemic, strong expectations from workers, customers, local communities, and wider society. This digital conference, therefore, today aims to identify the human rights risks caused by the pandemic, to highlight possible action business can take to address these risks, as well as share best practice. We have, I must tell you, an extremely distinguished panel with us. And welcome, I see some other people have just come, Jerome, Nozipo, all the friends of the business, human rights, environment are here. And our distinguished panel really has the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, who's agreed to join us and give a keynote address. Indeed, I must mention, I've found the High Commissioner to be very obliging, very engaging, and very available to us to assist and collaborate whenever we call on her. And I thank you for that, Madam Bachelet, for always being so willing. I'm certain you are very hectic, especially in these challenging times. The High Commissioner, some of you will have picked up, called at a very early point in time to take a human rights-based approach to respond to the crisis. And thank you again, Madam Bachelet. And then we also have Linda Kromjong, Global Labor and Human Rights Director at Samsung Electronics. Linda is known to many of us. Linda is part of the family. Samsung, as a global company and employing hundreds of thousands of people, is at the forefront when it comes to responding to the crisis. And I want to take this opportunity, Linda, to thank you for joining and sharing your practical company experience with us as well. I would also like to welcome John Morrison, Executive Director of IHRB, Institute for Human Rights and Business. IHRB just published a guidance for companies on respecting human rights in times of COVID. The IOE is also collaborating with the IHRB and John Morrison in a number of fields, such as within the Center for Sports and Human Rights. I bump into John everywhere, in airports and in the US, and I see him on Twitter. He was retweeting this morning when I tweeted that we shall have this conversation. Very early in the morning, he was up retweeting. Thank you for joining us, John. And then finally, let me welcome David Vermijs, Senior Advisor at Shift. Shift is very well known for its expertise when it comes to human rights and the UN guiding principles, and can share valuable insights from their engagement with companies on this topic. Thank you very much, David, for availing yourself to us this afternoon. Just two quick housekeeping measures, and then we can kick off. I'm sure all of you are very well versed, unlike the meeting that I come from, where about half the 123 people's mics were on. They were not muted, which caused, as you can imagine, an alarming kind of concert of discord. So please mute yourselves if you don't speak, to avoid any unwanted background and sometimes even embarrassment. I mean, there are certain things that tend to happen when you're alone, or you think you're alone, that might come through, and we don't want to have a comedy instead of serious discussions. And also, please use the chat function on the right side if you have any comments or questions. I and my team, led by Matthias Thorn, who you've seen, Matthias is with us. We'll have a close look at the chat function, and this will facilitate the discussion. So thank you so much. And without any further ado, dear High Commissioner, I hand over the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Mdwaba. As you have just mentioned, in just 4 months, the world has been transformed, and the COVID pandemic, I think one of the words that it's more used is unprecedented and growing global crisis, with, of course, devastating health, economic, and social impact in every country. And it is plunging the world economy into a recession of historic dimensions. As of the 1st of April 2020, the ILO new global estimates indicate that working hours will decline 6.7% in the second quarter of 2020, and that's equivalent to 195 million full-time jobs lost. So it is important to note, of course, that the final tally of annual job losses this year will depend on the evolution of the pandemic and the measures taken by governments and the private sector to be able to mitigate its impact. And I welcome the IOA's continued engagement in forging economic processes that uphold human rights and which can assist to shape effective responses to the pandemic, both now and in coming months, as the virus continues circling around the world. Many, if not most, businesses face the challenges of massive shifts in demand, supply chain, transportation, and mobility, and worker protection, to name just some of the major topics before you. It is clear that no business continuity planning system has processes in place that anticipate these massive, sudden, and simultaneous conjunctions of shocks. You need to mitigate the impacts of COVID, the impacts of lockdowns and transport halts, and also to look ahead and engineer your operational recovery from this crisis. Many businesses, and especially, of course, small and medium-sized enterprises, are facing catastrophic losses and have few, if any, tools to address these challenges. Workers too are facing shocks, and so are consumers, as you mentioned before. The fear of becoming infected, the prospect of losing livelihoods. These and other severe vulnerability are being exacerbated by inadequate social protection coverage, which means that millions of people around the world are unable to access adequate medical care or any social benefits. And also, we're telling everybody to wash their hands as a more effective remedy, and we have millions of people who don't have access to clean water. I understand that business leaders have a wealth of pressing concerns. Yet I would like to put workers and other ordinary people at the core of all your discussions today. The health of every business depends on both workers and consumers' well-being. And we need clear thinking and responsible solidarity to ensure that the least possible damage is done throughout this crisis to everyone. Your businesses are facing intense and immediate challenges, yet you must also look ahead. So the world will be living with this virus for months and years. We really don't know until we have a vaccine that really works. We will be living with this virus. So as the struggle to keep it in check continues, you, but also your workers, your consumers, and your communities will be adapting to these changes. And it is important that this community of mutual interest be at the core of the decisions you make. This commitment to human rights is the way to do good business and make more effective assessments on the way ahead. Fundamental human rights and freedoms make us all more resilient to crisis, more flexible, more adaptable, more accountable, and of course, better informed. The crisis that is unfolding due to COVID-19 is uncharted territory, yes, but we have a compass, human rights guidance and laws, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business Human Rights, that have been devised to help decision makers act responsibly and effectively in dealing with every kind of disaster and to help them build back better. So the baseline responsibility for all businesses is to respect human rights in their own operations and business relationships. The practical way to do so is to employ human rights due diligence processes to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address the human rights impact. And this tool can be key to your identification of the impact of COVID-19 on your supply chains, demand chains, and systems. So you need this precision and clarity to allow you to make adequate responses. It is essential and will continue to be throughout this epidemic that you identify, assess, and address the new risk it is generating so that you can shape prompt and relevant policies. Of course, I'm a medical doctor, a pediatrician. This is a health crisis. First and foremost, it is vital and urgent to ensure the health and safety of your workers, especially those in the healthcare sector, client-facing responsibility, or with significant workplace interaction. All workers without discrimination should have access to health care and protective material, and the risk of exposure should be reduced. Businesses should also be assessing the impacts on workers in their supply chains, and using their leverage to safeguard the rights of those who work for their suppliers. This is a matter of the most basic self-interest and core to upholding human rights. In this context, special attention needs to be paid to day laborers, non-contract workers, temporary employees, and those without social protection coverage who work in your supply chains. And many of them, of course, are women or from vulnerable groups, and your immediate assistance and support, including under lockdown measures, can be a lifeline. Many workers and small business owners will need immediate support to help them protect livelihood. And let me cite two, I would say, good examples or good practices. The clothing giant H&M has assured its manufacturing suppliers that it will not cancel or seek to renegotiate existing orders and will take delivery of goods in production. Unilever has committed to helping its most vulnerable small and medium-sized suppliers by extending touch loans. So we need, and there's another good practice as well. So we need more of this kind of creative thinking as we continue working throughout this crisis to protect jobs, protect health, and help people cope with adversity by investing in community-led resilience and response and assisting vital social protection measures. I also encourage you to act in the longer term to uphold the economic, social, civil, and political rights in the broader societies in which you operate and distribute products. Investors are already asking that what CEOs are doing to protect their wider ecosystems of staff, customers, and suppliers. There is a growing view that responsible businesses may be better placed to weather the immediate health crisis as well as the economic downturn ahead. Demonstrating respect for human rights, especially in times of uncertainty and economic hardship, is a strong reflection of a business core values. Humane, clear-sighted, and impactful measures that protect employees and communities and help them weather challenges will pay long-term dividends also in business reputations. We can't afford to leave anyone behind. If we have learned anything from COVID-19 is that nobody and no entity is an isolated unit. We are bound together and we benefit from each other. I want also to emphasize that this response to the pandemic must be global. We also cannot afford to leave any country behind. If developing countries with the least capacity to contain the pandemic become repositories for the virus, driving new waves of contagion, that will be a human rights disaster and also an economic disaster. So one day the streets, skies, and shipping lanes will fill again, but the world will be changed. How businesses respond to the crisis will shape their own futures as functioning entities, and it will contribute to shaping the future of millions of people, your direct employees, and many others. So preventing, mitigating, and addressing the damage being done to human rights will be key to maintaining trust with clients and consumers, your employers, your shareholders, and your community. It will be key to building a world of greater resilience. So I look forward to this discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Madam Bachelet. As usual, I think you've made all the very important points that need to be kept as a priority in everything that we do. And I think for me, you've repeated the call for social protection coverage, which has been exposed as being one of the biggest areas we need to find a way to deal with as we move forward. I think we've always known that social protection and social security are an issue that is we're finding very difficult to resolve for the world. But I think the virus and the pandemic has actually accentuated it and have shown us, especially in the informal sector and so on, that we need to find a quick solution. Issues of clean water, things we take for granted, washing of hands, that other people may not be able to do that because they don't have clean water, as you mentioned. And I think this clear thinking that is required. I'd like to hear from my other colleagues as they come in, how, in terms of their experiences, that this clear thinking is helping us move forward. The examples you've made on commitment to human rights, I think H&M, Unilever, these are some of the companies we were working with in terms of that IOE-ITUC agreement that we concluded 2-3 weeks ago to try and ensure that we galvanize as much support and as much collaboration as we possibly can. And I think lastly, where you make 2 points that are absolutely key that people tend to make on the level of rhetoric, I think without really thinking hard about them, that no one is an isolated unit. No one is an isolated unit. This has been demonstrated very, very well by this pandemic, and that we cannot afford to leave anyone behind. I think that for me is probably the one part that I think we need to shift our thinking. We need to find a way of changing gears and being able to say, how do we recalibrate this world so that we have more people thinking and going beyond thinking and doing this as we move forward. Now, colleagues, we are going to, I do again, please encourage you to send as many messages as possible on the side. I see there's a few messages that I will come back to later. But now we're going to move over to Linda Kromjong. I did mention that Linda is going to be sharing with us. They have hundreds of thousands of employees, and they're at the forefront of dealing with responding to the crisis. So Linda, over to you. Thank you very much again.
Yeah, thank you, Mthunzi, for giving me the floor. Thank you for a great introduction. I will try to be brief, and if we can move to the next slide. Yes, thank you very much. I think a lot already has been said, and this crisis is immense, and it has started for Samsung already in January in China, and it's now impacting us everywhere across the globe. Maybe just a few relevant figures. Mthunzi meant hundreds of thousands. It's 310,000 workers worldwide. We manufacture in 16 countries, and we have sales and R&D subsidiaries in 74 countries. And the impact indeed varies, so depending on the country, legislation, phase of COVID-19. And that also makes it difficult to have, say, one response to this crisis. I would like to say here, that's also what you see in the slide, what we value most are our people. So we put them first in how our first response to this crisis. Health and safety, that's what we have been heavily focusing on since January. What we learned in January is that there is not one global response. So we really had to have a global crisis team being put in place, but we needed to have regional responses as well, and even have country responses. So we needed to empower country management to take the measures that were fit for that specific situation, that environment. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm going to share with you the measures that we took, and I just want to go through 5 categories. And I would like to start with the first one, which is health and safety. And some of those things are absolutely in line with what other companies are doing as well. So we really focus heavily on health and safety during infection of people, making sure that they have the good medical support, but also making sure that we have enough preventive measures being put in place. So temperature checks are being the new normal. Readjusting, say, our production lines. If there are symptoms, people should self-quarantine. We are really encouraging new routines, and those really include, say, being a strong focus on hygiene, hand washing, disinfection of the offices and the production sites in a regular space, as well as public space on commuter buses and the dormitories that we have, of course. We do provide PPE for our workers as well as for our subcontractors on site, but those guidelines will depend per country, as the government guidelines differ there as well. Physical distancing, that's what we all are applying now in our workplaces, in the cafeterias, in using the elevators, but also in realigning our production layout and offices. And of course, we want to understand the data and the figures as a continuous reporting. And if people are sick, they will have, say, follow-up response, not only during, but also after care by our doctors or counselors. When workers are on sick leave, they will get paid in January 100% in line with local regulations. And that's the case in the majority of our countries. Business travel, almost non-existing anymore, with a few exceptions. And also meetings and trainings, as well as social gatherings, have come to a halt. And if we do them, we'll do those virtually. If I go to the next one, which is on business continuity, oh no, sorry, not the next slide. Can you go back, Elodie? Thank you very much. The second point, business continuity. We have gone through full closure of sites on extended closures in China, followed by impacting our production in Korea. Then we moved into Vietnam and other countries. And we have had phases of full shutdown, partly shut down, but also reopening again. And what we see now is also that our volumes of demand are being impacted, but also we have hiccups in our supply chain. Our offices in the far majority of the countries in the world are closed, and teleworking has become the new normal, although that might not have been, I would say, the general, say, Korean cultural fit in doing work. When work was not only partly possible, our workforce was in principle paid in full. In some of the countries, we had the option to ask for mandatory leave for a specific period in time during closure, if that was possible for policies, as per the policies that we apply. It's uncertainty for everything, so we do pay a lot of attention to make sure that people feel feel safe at work, but also we take care of their mental well-being and how they cope with stress, and we give them, say, additional guidance on how to deal with that. And we do indeed pay a special attention to vulnerable workers, such as migrant workers. And our migrant workers in our dormitories are predominantly in-country migrant workers, but just give one example, in India, our dormitories are still available, even despite our fact that our production sites closed. These remain available for all of them. We don't want to put them on the streets. If you look at the third point here, is the supply chain. We haven't changed our procurement practices. We have continued to pay in full what we ordered. We are continue working with our suppliers and fulfilling our contractual agreements. If we have to align our volumes, that's anyway part of our normal process, because volumes will differ anyway during the year. So we will discuss those with our suppliers, and we will not be able to unilaterally reduce the volumes without the consent of our employers. And this policy is to be followed even during COVID-19. The fourth point is on society and community. We are a technology company, and we are great in making sure that our production processes are as smart and lean as possible. So our engineering teams help in Korea companies that produce masks or other PPE to really look into optimizing their production capacity, and by doing so, increase the volumes that they were able to produce. We are engaging in similar initiatives in Europe, offering that help also to other suppliers here, that they can leverage our expertise in smart engineering. In Korea, we offered the local authorities one of our company facilities to be used as a as a care center for patients, to assist them in the measures against COVID-19. And then we're also offering a lot of in-kind support linked to our business, whether that's providing mobile devices for people being connected at home because they're elderly, or for students so that they can still go to school, for hospital staff so that they can have their own phone at work without needing to take their own ones, and hence, also reduce the risk for COVID-19 spread. And we, of course, are donating as well to governments and communities to really make sure that they can buy, the products that they need in their efforts to combat COVID-19. And that includes funding for medical supplies and hygiene kits, such as face masks. And if I then move into the fifth point of this part, it's the impact on human rights agenda, which was a topic of this this webinar. And I would like to say four things here. Due diligence. Due diligence was mentioned by Michelle. It's extremely important, but how do you do due diligence during COVID-19? Because you know that auditing on the ground is an issue. So we're working actively here with all the other businesses. What other solution do we have to make sure that we do apply due diligence, but also apply the lens that we think is needed for this specific situation we currently are in? It's also a strong focus on how can people return to work in a safe manner if and when people will be able to return to work, whether it's being production in our offices. Thirdly, if we look into a very direct impact example, is that in our labor human rights training that we planned for this year, we had to shift gears. And instead of doing that in a classroom training, we're going to really go for a few online training suite for all our employees within Samsung Electronics. Starting this year, but we might need a bit longer and move into 2021 to roll it out completely. And what we also see with the human rights agenda, that stakeholder engagement is extremely important now, even more so, but we have to do that in a virtual manner. So we connect using the tools like we're using here now in this IOE webinar. If we can go to the next slide now, Elodie. Thank you very much. So if in summary, what's next? I think next is still health and safety. That's where we will continue to focus on for the current situation as well as for the return to work situation. Secondly, communication is key, and communication is global communication for sure, but more importantly is a local communication, a local language to our people as the situation and measures will differ. But also making sure that we engage with our people, even if they are not at our workplace, whether they work remotely or whether they're temporarily being at home because the production has stalled. The engagement with people is important, and we need to find ways to connect with them despite, I would say, the physical distancing issues that we stumble across now. If we are looking into the future, adjusting to new reality, it is really unclear what the future will bring. We need one thing for sure. We will need to adjust to new reality to ensure business continuity. How that's going to look like, that's a bit unclear. We can't predict everything now, but for sure it will look different. It will drive new solutions, but it will also pose new challenges upon us, and it will change the way we work. I'm going to pause here now, interest of time, hand back to Mthunzi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. Much appreciated. I think there are some points that have been raised by a number of people that we've already dealt with. On the chat, Farouk had asked a question. By the way, welcome, Farouk. Farouk comes to so many of these digital conferences, and Farouk is from Bangladesh, where we had the biggest issues with the garment clothing industry that Madame Bachelet mentioned earlier as well. And he was asking about due diligence, Linda, and the auditing challenges that you have on the ground. And I'm happy you responded to that without even seeing it on the chat, I think on the side. So I think that helps. The health and safety that you talked about, I think coming fresh from yesterday, some of you may or may not be aware that yesterday was World Health and Safety Day celebrations at the ILO. So we issued a statement there, the IOE, which is on LinkedIn and it's all over on Twitter, supporting OSH and how critical this is important in terms of making sure that people are safe at work, in terms of sustainability, in terms of preventative measures that must be taken rather than reacting. You've got to work way in advance and anticipate some of these challenges in terms of productivity and all those kind of issues. I see also there's a note that's been mentioned on the side by Alette von Leer, a colleague of ours from the ILO, that the ILO has just released new data that 305 million full-time jobs are already lost, and nearly half of all the global workforce at risk at the moment of losing livelihoods. I saw that being retweeted by Nozipo, who's with us here as well on Twitter. So we've got some high level of activity. We're now going to, and by the way, just so that you are free, Madame, I know that the High Commissioner needs to leave at about 5 to 3. I also need to leave at 1 minute to 3, Madam Commissioner, just after you, because I've got another webinar in the US that I must participate in and contribute to. So we'll try and manage the time carefully, but when you have to leave, please do leave And I'll say goodbye to you at the right time. I'll be watching the clock. And now handing over to John. John, please talk to us. John, as I've mentioned already, is a big partner of ours. The IHRB is a big partner of the IOE. We do a lot of things, and particularly lately with the Center for Sports and Human Rights, so we can also hear about sport. I mean, my television has been rather bleak lately, John. So over to you.
Sorry, Mthunzi, I wasn't preparing to talk about sport on this call, but we can do that some other time. And I also miss not seeing you at airports. We won't be seeing each other at airports for a while, I think. No. So I will still be tweeting at 5 o'clock in the morning. I'd like to recognise Madam High Commissioner as also a partner in the Centre for Sport and Human Rights, which was a big endeavour of recent years. But I'd like to talk more about the report we issued 2 weeks ago, Respecting Human Rights in the Time of the COVID-19 Pandemic. 60-page report, and I'm not going to go through the whole thing at all. I'm just going to pull out 1 or 2 aspects of it that resonate with the conversation we're having at the moment. I do think, before I start, I think an evidence-based approach to the way that we proceed from here is really important. Now, obviously, we can't wait in an academic sense for peer-reviewed evidence. We need to move quickly, but nor should we bring our own prejudices and predilections to the problem without self-awareness. There's a danger when the world faces these problems that we all advocate for the solutions we wanted to see before the problem started. Now, there might be good reason for that, but I also think we should be open to different views. And one thing I've very much valued over recent weeks is the way that employers, trade unions, civil society, governments, and the UN have come together with many of these discussions. The 60-page report has been well received. Last week, we also had our own webinar with Sharon from the ITUC, John from ICC, Anita from the Human Rights Working Group, and Marcella from Unilever, beginning to unpack some elements of it. And we have another one next week on Bangladesh specifically, mainly with Bangladesh-based stakeholders and the millions of jobs at stake there. And then we have another one with the OECD and the Swiss government on the trade dimensions to the current crisis. But the report, and I hope some of you have had the chance of looking at it, sets out the broad range of human rights impacts of the current crisis. In relation to the virus itself, you have issues around quarantines, surveillance, racism and xenophobia, the vulnerability of migrant workers, women and other vulnerable groups, human rights defenders, the poor, and the fact that all rights, actually every single human right you can think of, is raised in the current crisis, and I would say also falls within the business and human rights nexus. We then remind the audience of the business and human rights approach as set out in the UN Guiding Principles, and then put forward some of our thinking and reflect some of the good practice that's emerging around particular cases and contexts, such as workplace practices, protecting and supporting workers, dealing with sickness, communicating clearly, engaging with unions, support and strengthening the supply chain, respect and reassure customers, be creative about your strengths, protect undocumented people, and consult with authorities, etc. So there's all of that. Now, the 4 points I just want to leave on the table out of all that. The first is, I think we're going to leave this with a different understanding of what essential workers are. I think everyone's preconceptions over who was really essential to the global marketplace will have changed if they haven't changed already. And what is undoubtable is that many of these workers in global supply chains, but also in health and care, in transport, logistics, in retail, are not necessarily well paid. Many are vulnerable, and the very different approaches. Now H&M has been singled out, as is Unilever and Samsung, as companies that have definitely done the right thing. Many other companies haven't. They've triggered force majeure and they've let suppliers fall. Some are stockpiling, some are hoarding, some are claiming a lack of liquidity, etc. But there's a very different approach taken by many companies as opposed to those that have been mentioned. And we know, I think, the case for due diligence is clear. If you don't look at all the workers in your global supply chains, including migrant workers, as Linda has already set out, then you are going to face consequences. And Singapore, I think, is an example where they're facing a sort of second wave of pandemic at the moment, partly because migrant workers weren't part of the initial response. The second point I want to raise is on essential commodities and services. I think we are beginning to think again about what commodities are essential to the global marketplace. There is the big crisis in oil, which you'll be familiar with. But if we think about trading of commodities, a third of Africa's debt, external debt, is to private creditors, and commodity traders are large amongst them. The reforms after the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 very much focused on the mainstream private banking sector. And IFIs, of course, have been in the front guard of the response. But what about private actors like commodity traders and their responsibility around food, medicine, and essential commodities, copper, cotton, and so on, as well as debt relief and some of the other measures that the states are taking? I think that's under focused at the moment. The third point is transition. We were already talking about just transition in relation to climate and automation, the perfect storm that's approaching. COVID has perhaps expedited that conversation. We need to think about how we bring communities and workers with us on these inevitable transitions that the world will be facing. And the final point, the issue of remedy. We're going to face a remedy tsunami in the months and years ahead. And there's no legal system in the world that will be able to cope with it. There'll be claims against business, business will be claiming against government, governments will be claiming against each other, etc. We need now to think about alternative dispute mechanisms, the kind of mechanisms that could possibly deal with the avalanche of remedies that are going to be coming in the months ahead. So I hope those ideas are useful, and I very much enjoyed being part of the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I'm obviously disappointed you didn't talk about sport, but I do understand there's a lot to talk about this afternoon. I think the points for me that I just want to recap, which are very similar to also what Linda said, we need to adjust to a new reality. So, you know, we have all these words now, you know, we must recalibrate, we must reset, we must shift. And I saw something from Vlatka saying that we are going to have to do things very differently from the way we did things. We need to join forces to help humanity deal with the consequences and become very creative to offer solutions and change outdated management practices. And later, once David has spoken, I would like all of you to also think, and maybe before the High Commissioner leaves, she can also maybe share a word or two to a question that Nozipo asked. Nozipo says, in what ways can boards step up and hold management to greater accountability for the decisions made by business today? That we'll come back to that. Hopefully the High Commissioner will also still be here after David speaks. So now we move over to David. David, I did introduce him, is from Shift. He's a senior advisor at Shift, very well known for their expertise when it comes to human rights and the UN guiding principles. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be part of this distinguished group of speakers, and I will try to stick to the allotted time so that we can get to this discussion, which should be possible as my points build much on the foregoing. Can you see my slides? I think you can, right?
We are looking at your slides, very nice colors, pink, white, and gray.
Thank you very much. So I work for Shift, a nonprofit organization that works with governments, civil society unions, international organizations, and indeed business, including financial institutions, on implementing the UN guiding principles and on business and human rights. And I think, as has been very well shared with the prior speakers, we see that this crisis impacts on many people, and it also affects businesses in diverse ways. And as a consequence of those diverse ways in which businesses are affected, we see that people are very differently impacted. And I think we have heard many examples, so I won't recount all of those. But what I also hear, and what we're also seeing throughout, is that what is common among all of these ways in which individuals are impacted in their human rights is that the most vulnerable groups are hit hardest. And we've also seen that many publications and much guidance has come out, very good guidance just mentioned by prior speakers, both from an individual company, Samsung, as well as IHRB's excellent report about how to address the vulnerabilities and the human rights risks. And what we're hearing from companies, and the companies in our business learning program, with which we also had a webinar about 2 weeks ago. And when we hear and when we apply the lens of UNDPs, I think that we're seeing 5 key approaches of how business could and should consider as a human rights respecting business. And so I'll cover those briefly. I think the first is to apply the lens of vulnerability when prioritizing action. As I said, the most people that are most at risk are in many ways the most vulnerable. And companies that apply the lens of vulnerability, whether they are working in the context, in the office next door, or several tiers in the supply chain, are the companies that apply this human rights lens. We're seeing, as we heard, that companies are allowing their business partners to delay payments or accelerating payments to suppliers so that they can continue to pay their workers and in time. We're seeing banks, for example, deferring loans to their SME clients. And in a growing number of cases, we hear that these decisions are explicitly framed as supporting the most vulnerable. Second, this was also mentioned, involving stakeholders in critical decision-making processes. And we're seeing that companies with established relationships with organizations that can credibly represent the perspectives and experience of people who are affected appear to fare better than others. And it's also clear to me that companies who have managed to build the focus, capacity, and internal buy-in for listening to and incorporating those perspectives have been able to focus sooner and better on the most vulnerable people. Third, I think in many ways that leveraging government on their policy responses is a very significant contribution that companies can have. Obviously, no single company or single initiative or group of companies can handle this crisis alone. And perhaps one of the most effective uses of a company's leverage is indeed to advocate with governments, which means that they should call on governments to embed human rights in their own state's responses. For example, into the safety net that should be in place to support workers, in providing clarity on who is deemed essential, in understanding how the government's own procurement practices can impact workers, and also in providing a clear message that this is not the moment to use this as an opportunity to enhance repression, surveillance, or sweeping invasions of privacy. Fourth, to communicate clearly about your actions as a company. We see that this crisis allows all kinds of actions that we didn't think were possible before, like CEOs taking substantial pay cuts, responsible companies not exercising force majeure clauses in supply chain contracts, and companies committing to paying workers even when those workers cannot continue to do the work due to, for example, child care responsibilities. And we think that it's essential that companies publicly share these actions, not just for PR purposes, but also to demonstrate the scope of what is possible, and it can help change the standard that other businesses will be held to the point that John was making about not all companies responding in the same way. And also communication in a public way is particularly important when there are severe risks to people involved, as is the case right now, and where it is likely that trade-offs are going to have to be made by business, which is also clear. The final point I want to make is about the need for us to have honest discussions about the risks that are baked into the business model. Much has rightly been made about how companies are repurposing products and supply chains to support the efforts against the crisis. Yet, and while this is of course laudable, these actions are peripheral to why and how these businesses operate in the long term. Without consideration of the human rights risks that may be baked into companies' business models and how the crisis has exposed or exacerbated them, the impact of these kinds of positive actions will be short-lived. For example, the commitments made to temporarily provide healthcare and benefits to contract or self-employed workers only expose their innate vulnerability to economic shocks and the company's dependence on a workforce model that risks prioritizing cost over the health and well-being of the people doing their jobs day in, day out. The critical and perhaps life-saving decision to honor payments for orders when suppliers have already been paid for raw materials underlines the way that just-in-time supply chains can also place significant risks onto those suppliers operating in countries with the weakest labor protections. And that tech companies and mobile operators in some jurisdictions are committed to maintaining privacy while providing anonymous location data to inform social distancing policies, at the same time highlights their challenges and often inabilities to protect privacy in the same way in authoritarian countries where they nevertheless continue to do business. All companies, including those that have made striking short-term commitments to ease the immediate impacts of COVID-19, should take the time to also consider how such vulnerabilities became so ingrained in their business models in the first place, and what they can do to reduce the underlying causes. While this is certainly the most challenging of the approaches that I have set out here, it is also one that will make the biggest contribution, in our view, to reducing vulnerability and inequality, and will likely be the approach that will decide the long-term sustainability of many companies, as was also emphasized before. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, David, especially for those 5 practical approaches for the guidance that you give, because that's exactly what we need. And they also deal with quite a few of the issues that have been raised on the chat on the side. So I think what I'll do is I've got a few other questions, but I want to prioritize the High Commissioner because she needs to leave in 5 minutes, just in case she has questions, she has a comment, and maybe if she could just, if possible, share her views about the question that Nozipo asked earlier about how boards step up and how management is made to, any suggestions for more accountability and so on, or anything else that moves you, High Commissioner, before you leave us.
Well, I think a lot of very important things have been said, and of course, we had mentioned the due diligence, human rights due diligence process are essential and need to be, and it was said for others as well. We're living in a world where everybody's interconnected, and today everybody is about COVID-19. And you see the social media, but not only social media, television shows every time good practices, but probably there will be a minute that will also be showing bad practices. And we know that the UN guiding principles on business human rights, it's the right thing to do, but it's also a huge benefit for companies to avoid the reputational risk. So I think everything that you can do, not only to ensure that other companies would share good practices and lessons learned, but also to ensure that throughout all the process, through the supply chain, because many times talking to the businesses that are really committed to human rights, they say their problems are with supply chain, that they cannot ensure that they don't violate human rights, or with SMEs, MSMEs. I think governments and international institutions have to support medium and small sized enterprises, because for them it's much more difficult, first of all, to survive, and second, and not to, I would say, go over human rights and violate human rights. And I think you have to give also the example showing that practice, but also insisting on all those companies of the supply chain, on one hand facilitating as IHRB, but also as Samsung has done in terms of the products that they and the delivery of the products, but on the other hand to share these practices with them so they can really in a very, very difficult context be able to, on one hand, survive, on one hand, but I think it's important now during the response, but also to think on the recovery phase, how you support the smallest, but on the other hand, change the way of doing things. I think everybody's talking about the new normality. I think there's a huge opportunity because what COVID-19 has shown is the huge inequalities in every area, and of course in labor and the way we're doing things. And companies also should understand that COVID-19, like SARS, like MERS, are zoonoses. So we need to ensure climate action. We need to respect biodiversity, because otherwise we'll be having more and more of these pandemics in the future. So I think, and the last thing I want to say is, I think we need to really think on the role of women and how we really acknowledge what they've been doing, because first of all, 70% of health workers are women. Female leaders, women female leaders have done a great job in the countries. So I think this should be an opportunity to think on the world we all want to live. That is a better world for everything. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. Muchas gracias. I do want to say that I was wondering when you would talk about the role of women, because I've always, the first encounter I had with you when I was in Chile, in your, I think your last 2 to 3 weeks of being the president of the country, you made a huge call about women in the room, and I remember all the women standing up and giving you a standing ovation and everything, and I've never forgotten. So every time you've spoken since then, and I think I've had these meetings, maybe 7, 8 encounters with you, you never forget the role of women. But I think, though, you are also talking about change. You are saying we need to change, we need to rethink. So I think this crisis is forcing us to effect the change we were trying to avoid, or rather a lot of us were being denialist, you know, and ideologues, and refusing to change. I think we are being forced to change. So I think on that, let me release you, High Commissioner. Muchas gracias. Hasta luego. And now,
bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. I think shifting to colleagues that have, I see that there's a very good conversation on the side here between Flatka and Jerome. Jerome started a whole thing about, you know, he says, how are we to recalibrate this world? Could we envisage a virtual and inclusive negotiation for the world after COVID? Then he says, crowdsourcing from people from all walks of life and continents for a possible shared humanity charter, perhaps, identifying the barriers. And then Flatka responds by saying, I think crowdsourcing is a great idea. We know from complexity theory how innovation can emerge from such interactions when we tap into the wisdom of a large number of people. I think now all these ideas, I mean, I want to also go back, for me, if one of you can comment, not John, because he raised it. John talked about a remedy tsunami. A remedy tsunami, everyone claiming against everyone. What are we going to do? Can anybody, who are the takers? Linda, David, do you have a way of responding to the remedy tsunami? John can respond to anything else, but the remedy tsunami, I want to hear from other people. Who wants to take it? No, nobody? Okay, maybe. Okay, Linda,
yeah.
Linda.
Yeah, I'm just saying, okay, well, remedy tsunami, of course, I think that's a word that sticks in everyone's mind somehow. But I do see this is to some extent is spot on. And also with regards to, say, the remedy tsunami, we already see now OECD complaints kicking in with regards to business allegation about not, say, having an effective response to COVID-19, protecting their people, but also how are we going to offer remedy, how we're going to identify, say, the root causes on that one, if, you know, if we don't address it in a appropriate manner. I don't have the answer. I'm just saying the remedy tsunami probably is a word to stay here, John.
Thank you, thank you. I recognize also Gabriela from the USAIB joined us. I didn't see her. I think we'll be together just now in the UN USAIB webinar that we are going into in the next 5-10 minutes. I think, colleagues, David, do you have something you want to say, maybe in just 30 seconds, and give everybody an opportunity, John as well, and Linda, 30 minutes to round off?
Yeah, I'll just briefly. Yep, I'll just briefly respond to remedy as well. I think that's certainly an area which has been most challenging for many companies, and indeed has been lagging behind in terms of the implementation of the UNGPs. And so I couldn't agree more with John about the need to look at alternative mechanism and also company-based mechanisms, not just as a way to resolve disputes and grievances, but it can also inform companies' due diligence processes and responses. So that is also an aspect that's highlighted by the UNGPs, which I would highlight here. And thank you for the opportunity.
David, I just want to bring your attention to a note that Gabriela has written on the side, what they are doing at USAIB for the mobilization of the many trillions in the multilateral development banks and so on. John, 30 seconds. Any last words of wisdom?
Well, Mthunzi, you wanted me to talk about sport, so I'll say something very brief on sport. The Centre for Sport and Human Rights is thinking very carefully about how to best use this year out of sport. The Olympics and everything has been delayed a year, as you know. So there's a sort of a restart possibility around sport. And there, I think, or even if your companies and your businesses are not directly engaged in sport, sport is a wonderful metaphor for communicating to peoples around the world how we can build back better after COVID, right? How we can protect athletes and fans, but how we can get sport restarted in a way that doesn't just privilege white male commercial sport, but sport that is more inclusive with a leveler playing field. So build back better and build back through sport, I think, is one of the metaphors for how we might do that. Thank you, Mthunzi, for the opportunity today. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you so much, John. Linda?
Yes, sorry, I had to unmute. Well, I think, John, you had very nice concluding remarks and putting this into the sport metaphor. I'm just going to conclude with one thing. Sharing is caring. I think it's so important that we do have these kind of webinars and other means to share information, because no one has a solution, no one can do it on their own. So sharing openly to the extent that's possible in finding better solutions for all of us, I think that's the way forward.
Sharing is caring whilst we keep our distance and get closer by being apart. This is amazing. I'm so fraught with contradiction, but it's working. I want to take the opportunity, colleagues, to thank you all. We need to round up now. It was a lovely conversation, very constructive. We couldn't respond to everybody else, but I think we did the best we could. Matthias will be, oh, there's Brian. I wanted to say hello, Brian. I saw Brian and I saw Bennett. All the usual suspects are here on this call. I want to, Matthias will be in touch with some of the other conversations we need to keep having. I think this was a really good idea to have this particular conversation about business human rights within the pandemic and how we all deal with it collectively. So thank you, colleagues. Please stay safe till we chat again. Ciao, ciao.
Thank you, Mthunzi. Thank you.
It's a real pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
See you now, Gabriela.
Have you all a wonderful week.
Bye.